BBC4 Collections, specially chosen programmes from the BBC archive.
She is a siren and a temptress. Full lips, dark, melancholy eyes, pools to drown in, long, luxuriant tresses of hair, which she winds like her beauty around the hearts of her victims. She knows the secrets of the damned. She is as mysterious as the ocean is deep. The beautiful but dangerous woman, the belle dame sans merci, enthralled the 19th century imagination. But her enduring image was fixed forever by one man, the pre-Raphaelite artist and poet Dante Gabriel Rossetti. In creating image after image of his perfect woman, he reinvented the ideal of female beauty for an entire generation. But the key to Rossetti lies in the compulsions that drove him. Behind the art was a man plagued by drugs and alcohol, by failed loves and mental depression, and almost paralyzed by the fear of criticism. Convinced that he'd failed as a painter, but determined to achieve immortality as a poet, he actually dug his own wife's corpse out of this grave in Highgate Cemetery to retrieve a manuscript of verses which he'd buried with her in a fit of grief-stricken passion. With that act of grisly exhumation began the last act of his tragedy, a classic 19th century tale of love and death. Rossetti hated showing his work in public, and since his death in 1882, there have been surprisingly few exhibitions of his work. This show at the Walker Gallery in Liverpool is the first major reappraisal for more than a generation. Every picture tells a psychological story, and taken together, Rossetti's works amount to a journey through his life, an intimate glimpse of his loves, desires, and anxieties. At the heart of it all are images of the three women who dominated his life. The wife whose early death would haunt him to his own grave, the prostitute who first awoke him to the pleasures of the flesh, and the forbidden lover who inspired his last words of poetry and his last paintings. Rossetti lived through revolutionary times. His father was an Italian literary scholar and political radical who fled his homeland after a failed uprising in 1820. Named after the Italian poet, Dante Gabriel Rossetti was born in London. A shy, bookish child, he immersed himself in Arthurian legends and medieval poetry.
He was the child of a father who was in exile and who was intending to return and take his family with him. And the whole family were kind of lived their lives in expectation of returning to Italy and making a different life there. Rossetti was caught up in that youthful idealism of 1848 and the democratic revolutions across Europe. And it was, I think, the failure of that revolution in Italy that dashed all the hopes of returning to the country of his origin and caused Rossetti to turn right away from politics and the modern world and return to a fictive, imaginative world that is not this one.
But to express his imagination in paint, Rossetti had to learn the rules. He went to the Royal Academy, but soon rebelled. The idea of a training that involved years of copying ancient statues filled him with horror. He joined forces with fellow students William Holman Hunt and John Everett Millais, who would go on with Rossetti to form a brotherhood, a pre-Raphaelite brotherhood. Like Knights of the Round Table, they had their code of honour, which they wrote down in the form of a manifesto. Goal number 1, to have genuine ideas to express. Goal 2, to study nature attentively. Goal 3, to sympathise with what is heartfelt, serious and direct in previous art. And goal number 4, most indispensable of all to produce thoroughly good paintings and statues. Easier said than done. Their touchstone was art from before the time of Raphael. The clear lines of Florentine fresco painting, the jewel-like colours of early Flemish art. And this, Ecce Ancilla Domini, Behold the Handmaiden of the Lord, was Rossetti's first attempt to show his audience what he thought a pre-Raphaelite painting should look like. It's a cross between Van Eyck and Botticelli, very thin paint, sparely applied, and with a pious subject reflecting the idealism of the group. It's an Annunciation scene. Gabriel, in fact, Rossetti's brother, William, is arriving to announce to the Virgin Mary that she will indeed be the Mother of God, and he holds this symbolic lily stem, pointing it at her womb. The Virgin, the girl, she stares at this lily with a kind of mixture of fear and compulsion, almost a kind of terror. And there's something very strange about this claustrophobic interior with its Victorian sickbed atmosphere. She's a tubercular maiden. She looks ill. She shrinks away from the Annunciate Angel. And what I'd never noticed before was that Rossetti's made her hair, and he is the great Victorian painter of hair, he's made her hair into a kind of seismograph of her uneasiness. It flickers electrically. There are strange little strands going here, there, and everywhere. It seems to dramatise some kind of deep-seated uneasiness, some kind of fear, perhaps fear of the sexual act. In his poetry of the time, Rossetti was forever idealising women, but in his relationships with women at the time, he seems to have had great difficulty in actually expressing himself physically. So I think of it as the very first picture, if you like, in this career that is a psychodrama in art. But the critics didn't like pre-Raphaelite painting. Perhaps with Rossetti's childhood of the Virgin in mind, one writer ridiculed their reproductions of saints squeezed out perfectly flat. And Charles Dickens mockingly proposed a pre-Galileo society of those refusing to revolve around the sun. Rossetti took criticism badly, and at the age of 22 he gave up exhibiting. Yet while he was paralysed, all around him was changing. Britain was on a fast track to industrial revolution, its economy growing at a steam-propelled pace. Rossetti was happy to sell his work to rich industrialists, but was morally opposed to their world of factories and workhouses. In art, if not reality, he did battle with the forces of progress.
I have a sequence where he challenges the Industrial Revolution on a penny farthing bicycle and slays the dragon of industry. I think both he and the rest of the Brotherhood, they were certainly against industrialisation and mechanisation.
Like many a sensitive Victorian, Rossetti turned away from the smoke and speeding change to a time that seemed more coloured by idealism, the Middle Ages.
Certainly Rossetti seemed happier in his dream world. It was a dream world both he and the other pre-Raphaelite brethren were reconstructing.
He returned repeatedly to a story from the poetry of his medieval namesake, the tale of Dante and Beatrice and their ideal love. And Rossetti found his own Beatrice in the artist's model Elizabeth Siddal, the woman whose face would haunt so many of his pictures and his life. Lizzie Siddal was a stunner, the pre-Raphaelite word for a beautiful woman, and she'd been spotted working in a hat shop. Flattered by their attention, she happily agreed to model for the Brotherhood, famously lying in a cold bath for Millet's Ophelia. This had done nothing for her already fragile health. But Lizzie became especially close to Rossetti, eventually sitting to no one else but him. He said later that when he first met her, he felt his destiny was defined. Lizzie would often visit Rossetti secretly at his new studio in Blackfriars, just north of the bridge. Living at Blackfriars, Rossetti found himself at the epicentre of a rapidly expanding city. Just north lay Smithfield Market, which supplied the growing population with meat. To the west lay the seat of government, the brand new Houses of Parliament, built in the latest neo-Gothic style, while to the east were the thriving docks of Victorian London, ferrying goods and passengers to and from the furthest flung parts of the globe. But Rossetti turned away from this world of change and progress and withdrew behind closed doors with his Lady Lizzie to draw and to paint. He drew her obsessively, creating the closest thing in British art to a cycle of love poetry, a series of intimate drawings, the equivalent to love sonnets, at once passionate and deeply coloured by artifice. Blackfriars Bridge was also the setting for Found, his only attempt to paint modern life. The Victorian fashion for moralising scenes lay behind his choice of this uncongenial subject, a prostitute confronted by her love, a humble farmer who tries to shepherd her back into the fold of society. Rossetti threw himself into the project with vigour, even travelling to Chiswick to find himself an appropriately rustic piece of wall to paint from nature. But his enthusiasm soon waned, and in the end the painting remains unfinished, no more really than a coloured drawing. But I think it's a significant failure, an emblem of Rossetti's inability or reluctance to really engage with the urban realities of the great city that he found himself living in. He said so as much himself. He said, "I'm thoroughly indisposed to ameliorate anybody's condition by means of pictures." Rossetti's art was no help to a poor prostitute, but his hard cash was. One night he was out walking in central London when his attention was grabbed by someone flicking peanuts at him. It was a streetwalker, a stunning prostitute by the name of Fanny Cornforth. Rossetti immediately asked her to model for him. She agreed, and soon after they'd begun an intimate sexual relationship. It was an awakening for Rossetti. Carnal knowledge changed him and his art. His poetry became more explicit, more erotic. Phallic symbols began to appear. And whereas his paintings of Lizzie Siddal had been the effusions of courtly love, his portraits of Fanny Cornforth were frankly sensual. He'd learnt another principle of art, one that had never quite made it onto the pre-Raphaelite list. Sex sells. The mouth that has been kissed loses not its freshness. Still it renews itself, as does the moon. Rossetti wrote those lines on the back of Bocca Baciata, based on an old Italian tale about a spectacularly promiscuous beauty. There's no hint of moral condemnation in this depiction of Fanny playing the part to perfection. And there's no trace of the art of pre-Raphael either. From now on, Rossetti looked to the sensuality of the Venetian High Renaissance, conjuring the sheen and colour of flesh and blood. Despite his infatuation with Fanny, Lizzie Siddal was still at the heart of Rossetti's life. And when her health got so bad that only the opiate laudanum could dull the pain, he became overwhelmed with pity and guilt. They married in 1860. Just a year later, their first and only child was stillborn.
That loss of his daughter haunted Rossetti for the rest of his life. Later in life, he would hear noises in the house, but outside the door of the room, and fervently believe that these were the footsteps, the ghostly footsteps of his lost daughter at the age she would be then. So I think those sorrows went very deep into Rossetti's soul.
But most of all, it destroyed Lizzie. And one night in 1862, Rossetti returned home to find her in a coma from laudanum. Suicide or not, she never woke up. At her funeral, beneath her hair, the hair Rossetti had drawn so many times, he placed the manuscript of his poems, which he now felt were his finest works. It was a romantic gesture which he would come to regret. Rossetti felt he could no longer live in Blackfriars, too many painful memories, so he moved to a large house in Chelsea. He began to suffer from insomnia and night terrors, which would dog him to the end of his life. Perhaps to assuage the grief of having lost both wife and daughter in such a short space of time, he created a weird surrogate family in the form of a vast menagerie of exotic animals. As well as a Pomeranian puppy named Punch, Rossetti acquired an Irish deerhound called Wolf, dormice, rabbits, wombats, peacocks, armadillos, kangaroos, an African bull or zebu, and a pair of ungulated grass parakeets. Red in tooth and claw, the animals regularly escaped to cause havoc in the neighbours' gardens, and just as often killed and ate each other. Yet somehow, in this atmosphere halfway between a hothouse and a madhouse, Rossetti continued to paint. Rossetti resumed his relationship with Fanny Cornforth, taking her on as housekeeper cum lover. He painted vigorously, if a little repetitively, in his new sensual style, creating take after take of the beautiful woman. Rossetti was entranced above all by a fine head of hair. Loose hair signified loose morals. The sexual suggestiveness of these pictures to the Victorian eye can't easily be overstated. They sold like hotcakes. Maybe that should be cheesecake. But Rossetti became plagued by doubts. In a dark moment, Rossetti said that to be a painter is just the same as to be a whore. And there are signs that he increasingly feared that he was prostituting his own talents for commercial gain. Perhaps that's another reason why Found, that picture of a whore who refuses to mend her ways, ended up unfinished on his easel. It was too close to the bone, an allegory of his own predicament. I think the picture that takes us closest to Rossetti's true feelings is Beata Beatrix, his solemn memorial to his wife, showing Lizzie as the poet Dante's Beatrice, being mystically transported from earth to heaven. But just as in his Annunciation, Rossetti turned it into a kind of psychosexual confession, displacing Dante's religious symbolism with his own idiosyncratic imagery. A haloed red dove, like but unlike the traditional dove of the Holy Spirit, drops the poppy of sleep and opium, the laudanum that killed her, into Lizzie's hands. Her eyes are closed, suggesting a state poised between deathly ecstasy and drug-induced hallucination. Yet it remained a picture, an image, Rossetti was never comfortable with. Rossetti said that an artist often hates his own best work in the same way as envious souls hate the great works of others. It's a perpetual reproof. And I wonder if he had Beata Beatrix, the still centre of his life and career, perhaps the best picture he ever painted, in mind when he made that remark. And as if to sully its purity, he painted numerous inferior versions of it for his private patrons. Even Rossetti's oldest supporters felt he'd betrayed his own romantic ideals with his endless variants on the sexy stunner. The critic John Ruskin said these new paintings were as coarse as the prostitute who modelled for them. Rossetti's insomnia worsened, and having been a teetotaler up until now, he turned to whiskey to take away the taste of his prescribed sedative, chloral.
In the late 1860s, he began to suffer severely with disturbed vision, and he felt that he wouldn't be able to paint anymore. And therefore, he wanted to try at immortality through his poetry. He had been collecting his poems together and writing new ones and revising. And indeed, he had got a full collection of verse ready. And that was the one that was sacrificed in Lizzie's coffin. It was practically ready for publication. So it was a big sacrifice.
He wrestled with himself, but finally, consumed by literary ambition, he sought legal permission to have his wife exhumed. On the 5th of October 1869, hired men dug up the grave and retrieved the precious book. Once the manuscript had been exhumed from the coffin, it was scraped clean of putrefaction and placed in disinfectant for 2 weeks before being handed to Rossetti, who got on with the job of transcribing the verses. The pages were worm-eaten, and the stench, despite the disinfectant, was said to be unbearable. But soon the dirty deed was done. Rossetti felt justified. As far as he was concerned, his creative salvation was at hand. Spurred on by the retrieval of his poems, Rossetti wrote a mass of new verse in his quest for fame, some of it daringly erotic, inspired by the new woman in his life, Janie Morris, wife of his best friend, the artist William Morris. Rossetti's love life, as ever, was complicated.
He really couldn't get the muse and the stunner together in his erotic life. He couldn't get his sexual life together at all. But what it did do is, I think, to enable him to understand desire. It enabled him to experience the erotic in a way, I think, that very few people of his generation really did. And it seems to me that what's important about him is that capacity to open up erotic experience seriously, not just express some kind of tumultuous feeling.
This hour be her sweet body all my song. Now the same heartbeat blends her gaze with mine. One parted fire, love's silent countersign. Her arms lie wide open, throbbing with their throng of confluent pulses, bare and fair and strong. And her deep-freighted lips expect me now, amidst the clustering hair that shrines her brow, 5 kisses broad, her neck 10 kisses long.
Rossetti was writing about a century which was opening itself up to the erotic, to sexuality, to, concurrently with that, to commodity culture, where the primacy of tasting, of touching, of feeling things surfaces, was acutely important. He was a poet writing for a new modern identity.
Rossetti hoped that his poems, published in 1870, would make his name live forever. But the critics, James Buchanan in particular, were not impressed. There was no soul in this verse, said Buchanan, only body. And what an ugly body it was. Females who bite, scratch, scream, bubble, munch, sweat, writhe, wriggle, twist, foam, and in a general way slaver over their lovers. There was worse to come. He insinuated that this impure art and poetry had its wellsprings in an impure life, that Rossetti was an adulterer, a libertine. The critic's shiver of disgust was almost palpable. And as for Rossetti, he was devastated. Not only had Buchanan destroyed his good name, but he'd given voice to Rossetti's own worst fear about himself, that his spiritual, idealistic side was just a mask, a sham, and that he was nothing but a grubby little sensualist. Rossetti expressed this himself in an extraordinary poem, Lost Days, in which he's confronted by all the former selves that he once was and whom he's buried for gain. I am thyself. What hast thou done to me? Each one says to him, pledging to haunt him for all eternity. Rossetti fell into paranoia and hallucinations. The nightmare of his poem became reality. It was too much, and one night Rossetti took an overdose of laudanum. Rossetti's suicide attempt failed, and he was nursed back to health by Janie Morris. Their relationship became even closer. William Morris turned a blind eye to the affair to save his marriage. He took a joint lease with Rossetti on a country house called Kelmscott Manor, and then promptly left the country, leaving the two lovers together. At Kelmscott, Rossetti and Janie enjoyed one idyllic summer, and he recovered the inspiration to paint. Particularly during the early years of their relationship, Rossetti painted Janie Morris as a languid, melancholic, rather passive muse. But But in reality, she was an extremely active collaborator in her own image, and therefore in the creation of the Rossettian femme fatale. Unlike most Victorian women, she didn't wear hoops and stays, but just these extraordinary long flowing gowns. She experimented with different poses, and she grew her hair into this amazing thick forest of dark wiry curls. Like a model with a celebrity photographer, Janie posed for the photos that Rossetti styled, which he then transformed into living colour. But their relationship couldn't last. Her young children began to ask awkward questions about Uncle Dante. In 1874, she pushed him away from Kelmscott, and into a terminal depression.
Rossetti's patrons began to get impatient with the dark tones of his painting, and so he tried rather self-consciously to lighten the palette and to make them more cheerful. But his heart wasn't in that at all. His heart was really in those very dark and somewhat disturbing portraits of Janie.
Rossetti had always said he lived for love, and in the end he died for the lack of it. In 1882, at the age of 53, racked by his addictions, he died. Rossetti can easily come across as a terminally nostalgic artist, a painter mired in a fantasy vision of the past, the typical British cul-de-sac, an artist going nowhere. Rossetti doesn't give us perhaps what we think late 19th century art, great late 19th century art should give us. He doesn't give us the transient glimpse of urban experience. He doesn't give us what Degas or Manet or Monet give us. He does give us something else, something very interesting, a kind of glimpse of psychological reality, much disguised, veiled as allegory. But he paints a certain kind of uneasiness. He struggles with his own relationships, his aspirations, his dreams, his desires, and he finds a way of compressing them into these strange, rich, dreamy pictures. I think his work inaugurates a whole strain of modern art in which painters would attempt to merge their own personal experience with the archetypal forms of myth. And the most famous exponent of that strain or form of modernism was Picasso. And interestingly enough, Picasso actually owned up to being influenced by the languorous dreams of the pre-Raphaelites and of Rossetti when he embarked on his early work. So although Rossetti was fixated on the past, he was also a prophet of the future. No one had ever painted their own psychic autobiography in this strange, sexy, haunting way. Without knowing it, Rossetti had opened a whole new world of possibilities for modern painting.